Publius Cornelius Tacitus, Historiae, Book 1, Sections 1 through 5. Summary View: The State of the City of Rome in the Year of 4 Emperors. Translated by Arthur Murphy, published 1753, read by David Prager Branner. The era from which it is my intention to deduce the following narration is the second consulship of Servius Galba, when Titus Vinius was his colleague in office. Of the antecedent period, including a space of 820 years from the foundation of Rome, the history has been composed by various authors who, as long as they had before them the transactions of the Roman people, dignified their work with eloquence equal to the subject and a spirit of freedom worthy of the old republic. After the Battle of Actium, when, to close the scene of civil distraction, all power and authority were surrendered to a single ruler, the historic character disappeared, and genius died by the same blow that ended public liberty. Truth was reduced to the last gasp, and various circumstances conspired against her. A new constitution took place, undefined and little understood. Men resigned their rights and lived like aliens in their native country. Adulation began to spread her baneful influence, and a rooted hatred of their ambitious masters rankled in the breast of numbers. Between both parties, one paying their court and the other brooding over public injuries, the care of transmitting due information to posterity was utterly lost. It is true that against the seductions of the time-serving writer you may be on your guard, but on the other hand, spleen and calumny are devoured with a greedy ear. Flattery wears a badge of servitude, while malignity speaks the tone of independence, and is therefore well received. With regard to the writer of the following work, he can with truth aver that Galba, Otho, and Vitellius were neither known to him by marks of favor nor by personal injury. The foundation of his fortune was laid by Vespasian, advanced by Titus, and carried higher by Domitian. The fact must not be dissembled, but the historian, who enters on his office with a profession of integrity, must not desert the cause of truth. No character should be touched with partiality. None should be disfigured by passion or resentment. Of Nerva and Trajan, if my health continue, it is my design to compose the history. It is a favorite plan, rich in materials, and every way safe. I have reserved it for the evening of my days, a glorious period, in which, through the rare felicity of the times, a man may think with freedom, and what he thinks he may publish to the world. The subject now before me presents a series of great events and battles fierce and bloody, a portion of time big with intestine divisions, and even the intervals of peace deformed with cruelty and horror. The whole a tragic volume, displaying in succession 4 princes put to death, 3 civil wars, with foreign enemies a greater number, and in some conjunctures both depending at once, prosperity in the east, disasters in the west, Illyricum thrown into convulsions, both the Gauls on the eve of a revolt, Britain conquered and in the moment of conquest lost again, the Sarmatians and the Suevians leagued against the Romans, the Dacian name ennobled by alternate victory and defeat, and finally the Parthians taking the field under the banners of a pretended Nero. In the course of the work, we shall see Italy overwhelmed with calamities, new wounds inflicted, and the old, which time had closed, opened again, and bleeding afresh. Cities sacked by the enemy or swallowed up by earthquakes, and the fertile country of Campania made a scene of desolation. Rome laid waste by fire, her ancient and most venerable temples smoking on the ground, the capital wrapped in flames by the hands of frantic citizens, the holy ceremonies of religion violated, adultery reigning without control, the adjacent islands filled with exiles, rocks and desert places stained with clandestine murder, and Rome itself a theater of horror, where nobility of descent and splendor of fortune marked men out for destruction, where the vigor of mind that aimed at civil dignities and the modesty that declined them were offenses without distinction, where virtue was a crime that led to certain ruin, where the guilt of informers and the wages of their iniquity were alike detestable, where the sacerdotal order, the consular dignity, the government of provinces, and even the cabinet of the prince were seized by that execrable race as their lawful prey, where nothing was sacred, nothing safe from the hand of rapacity, where slaves were suborned or by their own malevolence excited against their masters, where freedmen betrayed their patrons, and he who had lived without an enemy died by the treachery of a friend. And yet this melancholy period, barren as it was of public virtue, produced some examples of truth and honor. Mothers went with their sons into voluntary exile. Wives followed the fortune of their husbands. Relations stood forth in the cause of their unhappy kindred. Sons appeared in defense of their fathers. Slaves on the rack gave proofs of their fidelity. Eminent citizens, under the hard hand of oppression, were reduced to want and misery, and even in that distress retained an unconquered spirit. We shall see others firm to the last, and in their deaths nothing inferior to the applauded characters of antiquity. In addition to the misfortunes usual in the course of human transactions, we shall see the earth teeming with prodigies, the sky overcast with omens, thunder rolling with dreadful denunciation, and a variety of prognostics, sometimes auspicious, often big with terror, occasionally uncertain, dark, equivocal, frequently direct and manifest. In a word, the gods never gave such terrible instructions, nor by the slaughter of armies made it so clear and evident that instead of extending protection to the empire, it was their awful pleasure to let fall their vengeance on the crimes of an offending people. Before we take up the thread of our narrative, it will not be useless to inquire what in that period was the state of affairs at Rome, and what the spirit that went forth among her armies, how the provinces stood affected, and wherein consisted the strength or weakness of the empire. By proceeding in this manner, we shall not content ourselves with a bare recital of facts, which are often ascribed to chance. We shall see the spring of each transaction, and a regular chain of causes and effects will be laid open to our view. The death of Nero, in the first tumult of emotion, was considered as a public blessing, but the Senate, the people of Rome, the Praetorian guards, and the legions, wherever stationed, were variously affected by that event. A new political secret was then for the first time discovered. It was perceived that elsewhere than at Rome, an emperor might be invested with the sovereign power. The fathers seized the opportunity, during the absence of a prince yet new to the reins of government, to exercise their ancient rights, pleased with the novelty of freedom and the resumption of their legislative authority. The Roman knights caught the flame of liberty. Honest men began to entertain hopes of the Constitution. Such as stood connected with families of credit, and the various clients and freedmen of illustrious men driven into exile, were all erect with expectation of better times. The inferior populace, who loitered away their time in the theatre and the circus, the slaves of abandoned characters, and the sycophant crew, who without substance of their own had been pampered by the vices of Nero, all of that description stood covered with astonishment, yet panting for news and eagerly swallowing the rumor of the day. The Praetorian Guards had been, by habit and the obligation of their oath, always devoted to the imperial family. Their revolt from Nero was not so much their own inclination as the management of their leaders. Acting without principle, they were now ready for new commotions. The promise of a donative in the name of Galba was still to be performed. They knew that war is the soldier's harvest. Peace affords no opportunity to gain the recompense due to valor, and the favors of the new prince would be engrossed by the legions to whom he owed his elevation. Fired by these reflections, and farther instigated by the arts of Nymphidius Sabinus, their commanding officer, whose ambition aimed at imperial dignity, they began to meditate a second revolution. The conspiracy was crushed in the bud, and Nymphidius perished in the attempt. But the soldiers had thrown off the mask, and the sense of guilt served only to goad and spur their resolution. They talked of Galba with contempt and ridicule. They laughed at his advanced age. They inveighed against his avarice, and his rigorous discipline, by which he had acquired his military character, inflamed the prejudices of men who had been enervated by a long peace of 14 years. During that time, the dissolute manners of Nero diffused the general corruption, insomuch that the virtues which formerly gained the affection of the army were fallen into contempt. Nero was endeared to the soldiers by his vices. Galba, on the contrary, was rendered unpopular by the austerity of his manners. He was used to say that he chose his soldiers, but he never bought them. The maxim was worthy of the old republic, but no man thought it an effusion from the heart. His conduct and his words were too much at variance.